before we launch into our presentations, I just wanted to provide a very brief context of the organizations that we work with. Some of you will know about this and others may be new to this, but I wanted to explain why it's us here today to talk with you about algae. And I think I'd start by saying, obviously, all of us know that our lakes and our fresh water is a crucial part of our environment here. There's no question that it relates to everything that we do, and it relates to all the species that we share our watershed with. And for all of us that work or play or live or aspire to be here, the water is really a key component of that. And it's the driver too for what the District of Muskoka has tried to establish at the core of its water strategy. And this is a 20-year-old strategy, but it's been refined over time, and it includes tools to help policymakers and decision makers and individuals and lakeshore residents and community livers and seasonal residents and everyone find tools to protect the waters that they love, and doing so in an area without a conservation authority, which is a fairly distinctive part of Muskoka. And the water strategy has 4 components, and some of you will know this, but we have a lake system health program, and Summer will talk to you briefly about that a little later in the presentation, but that relates primarily to water quality and water monitoring. And we work also on broad environmental initiatives. We have just released a new climate strategy, a climate action plan, and we've undertaken floodplain mapping within the past year. So those are the broader watershed initiatives that the water strategy hopes to achieve. We also communicate on issues that are crucial to all of us, like today, things that are facing us all in the watershed. And we also support the Watershed Council, which is an evidence-based, nonprofit, volunteer-driven organization that creates positions on environmental matters across the watershed based on evidence. And we do a lot of programming and outreach to relate those messages to the community. And we'll talk about all of that as we go through the presentation. But beyond the district and Watershed Council, there's obviously a lot of organizations also working on matters that relate to algae. And that includes all levels of government. The federal government is interested because of the navigable waters, and algae impacts that. The township, and I thank you, councillors, for attending today. The township has significant issues related to algae management. The province here in Muskoka focuses a lot on algae related primarily through the Ministry of Environment and Conservation and Parks. We are fortunate to have the Dorset Lab to help us with that. So we're well served, but we're also well laden with layers of governmental interest. And we also have the Muskoka Simcoe District Health Unit, who are the communications folks on algae matters. So there's a number of people working on this from a bureaucratical standpoint, but also, and I don't have to tell you this, Real Lake, the community is a key part of this. It's the lake associations and the community organizations also that are watching the conditions of the water and relaying them. So there's a lot of voices in this mix, but we brought a few of them today. So with that, I think I'd like to start by turning it to Peter, former Real Lake cottager and watershed councillor, and he'll tell us all about algae, and we'll move through a few topics. Thanks.
Thank you, Christy. I wish in a way we could be doing this talk on the shores of Real Lake, because I have not seen Real Lake for about 15 years. I think the last time I saw it, it was to take my dad around to see it again, having moved into town after living on the lake for 20 years. I don't know Real Lake very well because I was out of the country, but my family has been on Real Lake since the mid-60s, 65, they started building the cottage, which was just the year after I left home and left the country. And I think they did it deliberately that way to keep me out of trouble. I don't know. Anyway, I think it's a lovely lake, but we're on Zoom instead, so we'll deal with Zoom. Real Lake is a fairly typical moderate-sized lake in Muskoka. It's got relatively clear water. You see a Secchi depth of 3 meters, which means it's typically good clear water. 10 meters deep is fairly typical for a lot of the smaller lakes in Muskoka. It has a reasonable sized watershed. That blue line, and I don't think I can control the cursor. I don't know if you can see the cursor moving. You're moving the cursor. I've got a cursor that I can see, and now I'm seeing your cursor. That blue line marks the edge of the watershed, and all the land inside that line drains into Rill Lake. So that's a fairly substantial piece of land that provides the source of the water that ultimately is in Rill Lake. If we can go on to the next slide and start talking about algae, the first thing I want to get across to you is that the algae are an enormous group of different kinds of creatures. They are not all one thing. There are many different things, and they're present in all our lakes, and they're vital to the well-being of those lakes. If we didn't have them, or if we somehow magically got rid of them, we would have real problems, because they're the base of the food web in the lakes. They produce all of the primary production in the lake. They do the photosynthesis, which produces the organic material that other animals can eat. They also produce a lot of the oxygen in the atmosphere. So when you're breathing in and out on the shores of Rill Lake, remember that some of the oxygen you're taking in has been put in there in the atmosphere by the algae in the lake. So we need those algae. They're good. Okay. Tremendously diverse group of creatures, as I said. Among the algae, the differences between one kind of alga and another kind of alga can be as great as the differences between you and an oak tree, or you and a mushroom, or you and a piece of slime growing on the shore. So these are very, very different kinds of creatures, and that is part of the complication of dealing with them. Because there's so many different kinds of creatures, even though they all look sort of the same to us, they can behave very differently. They can respond very differently to changing conditions. They can be found floating in the water. They can be found attached to the bottom or to things in the water. So the slime on the steps of your swim dock, that's algae. The slime on a rock on the shore, that's algae. The stuff floating in the water itself, a lot of that is algae. And like I say, we need them. Let's go to the next slide. I guess Rebecca's controlling the slides. Let's go to the next slide. The problem with algae is every now and then there's too much of a good thing. Every now and then, when conditions are good, algal populations do what all populations do when they're good. If you're living in a place which is really wonderful and life is good and there's plenty of food, you tend to have more children. It doesn't matter whether you're a population of humans or a population of fish or plants or anything. And algae are the same. It's just that algal reproductive cycles are very, very short. They can reproduce daily. And so when the conditions are really, really good, their populations can grow very, very quickly. And that's fine. They'll grow, they'll shrink again when conditions are less good. But when they become super abundant, when they become so abundant that these microscopic creatures become visible to the naked eye, they can also become noxious. They can become something that we don't value. They can become something that destroys the quality of our lives. So we would like to prevent them doing that. They can also sometimes cause fish kills. They can be toxic. And of course, it's the toxicity and the health concerns to do with toxicity that cause a lot of the concern about algae. But even if they weren't toxic, their noxiousness can be concerning. And so we want to know something about what we can do to prevent blooms becoming more frequent. One of the problems at the present time is that climate change may well be making conditions especially good for algae, which means that we're probably going to see more algal blooms in the future than we've seen in the past. Now, if we can go to the next slide. There are three main types of algal bloom in Muskoka. I told you that the algae themselves can be very, very different to each other. Well, these are three different groups of algae. Each one of these groups contains many different species of algae, but these groups of algae are all different to each other, and they tend to bloom at different times of the year, and their blooms look different and they behave different. They have different attributes. The filamentous green algae have a nice simple name because they tend to produce long filaments, single-celled, linked one to the other. So they produce a long, thin filament in the water column. Filamentous green algae typically bloom early in the year, in spring or the early summer. They can appear in a bloom as clumps or dense mats at the surface of stringy stuff. They can float just beneath the surface or at the surface, and they can produce a grassy odor, sometimes an unpleasantly grassy odor. And they, for that reason, something we don't like to see a lot of. Another group that blooms early in the year are the chrysophytes, the golden brown algae. And these animals, well, not animals, these algae will make the water appear cloudy or perhaps yellowish green in color near the surface. And they tend to produce a sort of a nasty taste in the water. It can be fishy or musty. You don't like that taste. They tend not to produce clumps or visible things on the surface. They tend to be just below the surface and this cloudy or yellowish green color. And then the final group are the blue-green algae, and they tend to bloom late in the year. They can typically appear late August, September. In fact, just last year, I think it was, there was a bloom in November. So they're becoming later in the year as our falls warm up. The blue-green algae, their technical name is the cyanobacteria, which is partly because they are actually much more closely related to bacteria than they are to any of the other algae. They're a very different kind of creature. Their blooms tend to look like somebody spilled some bluish paint on the surface of the lake. So you get this sheen over the surface of the bluish, greenish color, rather than something that you could think of picking up in your hands as a flocculent material like the filamentous green algae have. The fresh blooms often smell like newly mown grass, or they can smell like garbage. So the smell can be a bit of a problem. And it's the blue-green algae which are the ones that have some toxicity. A few of their species are sometimes producing toxins which are potentially serious for people as well as for animals. Now we go to the next slide. And the factors that contribute to algal blooms, well, we're still learning all of the details. The scientists are not yet in the position where they can say a bloom will occur on this lake next week because we haven't got to that point yet. But we do know that there are some things that are reliable indicators of conditions that favor a bloom. One is low winds. You have a period of quiet weather. The surface waters are not being disturbed. Surface waters warm up. Warmth generates more biological activity. Animals, plants reproduce faster, so do algae. So low winds allows them to come together at the surface of the water and produce blooms. Having plenty of phosphorus in the water. Phosphorus alone doesn't explain algae. We have lakes with low phosphorus levels that bloom. We have lakes with high phosphorus levels that frequently don't bloom, but phosphorus is one of those nutrients which is typically in short supply in the water. And if you have extra phosphorus put in, that can stimulate a bloom. And then finally, the warm temperatures I've already mentioned. And of course, lots of sunlight, because in order for algae to reproduce and therefore to build up their population numbers and create a bloom, they've got to be able to produce their food, which means photosynthesis, which means sunlight. So lots of sunlight, warm temperatures, low wind, little bit of nutrients in the form of phosphorus, you've got the conditions for a bloom. Next slide. Yes, I mentioned climate change may be making conditions more favorable for algae in Muskoka. This slide nicely summarizes something that's important for algae, but it's also more generally important, because I don't think people fully appreciate just how seriously the climate is being changed. These are not trivial changes that are happening. Muskoka is warming up, and 3 to 4 degrees warmer on average by 2050. That's 3 to 4 degrees warmer than it was back in the 1800s, but still, that's a lot of warming. Noticeably wetter, although the water is going to tend to come in the wintertime rather than the summer. So our summers are going to tend to be drier, which can also, for complicated reasons, make it more suitable for algae late in the year. Summer temperatures are obviously going to be warmer, and so on and so forth. All of these things are happening. Regardless of what we do, they're making the environment more favorable for algae. What we've got to do is figure out what we can do to try and make it that the algae are happy because they're good, we need them, but not too happy because we don't want them to be super abundant. And that's our challenge at the moment. And we haven't solved that challenge yet. And I think the next slide, oh, this is the last one for me. Yes, the blooms are increasing. I've just said all this already. The more heavy precipitation, yes, one of the things the previous slide didn't show is that the precipitation, rainfall is going to come in, the rainfall is going to come in heavier, more severe storms with more drought between them. And so that washes additional nutrients in. And my phone has just rung, which is just fine because I finished talking and I can mute my microphone for a few minutes.
Thanks, Peter. I guess I'm up next, and I'm going to pick up the thread where Peter left off and talk to you a bit about policies and programs. So maybe a little less exciting than Peter's content, but important nonetheless. So as Christy mentioned at the outset of the presentation, the Muskoka Water Strategy comes at the idea of watershed protection and management from many different angles. And one of the key tenets is having a suite of programs and policies related to lake system health, many of which connect in one way or another to reducing the likelihood of harmful algae blooms in our water bodies. So for the program component, they focus mostly on stewardship and outreach to any of us who live, work, and play on lakes and rivers across Muskoka. And the main goal of the programs is to improve our recreational water quality through education and action that we can all take in our day-to-day lives, but they also connect to the way that we use, develop, and maintain our properties. So on the slide, Rebecca has noted some of the available programs, several of which are delivered in partnership with other organizations, such as the Love Your Lake program, That one assesses the state of shorelines on a property by property basis and will provide property owners with a tailored suite of recommendations where they can improve their shoreline to lessen their impacts on water quality. So for Rill Lake specifically, there's been long-standing interest and participation in citizen science activities like benthic monitoring, or what we call looking at the bugs in the mud in the lake, and that can tell us a lot about the health of the lake. And Rill Lake's also been part in the past of the province's Lake Partner Program, which is delivered through the Dorset Environmental Science Centre. And this is a volunteer-based water quality monitoring program, which is available to all of Ontario's inland lakes. The district also undertook land use surveys in 2004 and 2014. And what those did was they took a closer look at the shoreline and determined how the shorelines around Rill Lake have been developed or altered by human-made features. In terms of recreational quality monitoring that's undertaken by the district, Rill Lake was being sampled on a 2-year rotation. So the last sampling event took place in 2018. So the lake was due for sampling in 2020 by the district. But unfortunately, as many of you might know, the sampling program was put on hold in 2020 due to disruption from the pandemic. So Rill Lake is slated to be sampled this year in 2021. And we're also looking to transition Rill Lake from that every 2-year sampling rotation to a yearly sampling rotation. And that's because the lake experienced a confirmed blue-green algae bloom in 2020, which is actually a good segue, Rebecca, to the next slide to talk about policies. So also under the umbrella of lake system health is a policy-based approach to recreational water quality, and that's delivered through the Muskoka official plan. So an official plan is a document that manages long-term growth and change across the district and the watershed in a way that respects environmental, social, and economic priorities that have been identified by our communities. After several years of review, the Muskoka official plan was totally refreshed in 2019. And through that process, there was considerable consultation with many individuals and groups, but importantly, the Ministry of the Environment, who helped us look at our water quality objectives and policies. And probably the most important objective is to protect and enhance water quality through sound land use planning decisions. In short, that means we need to ensure that new development or redevelopment around our lakes can take place in a way that doesn't negatively impact recreational water quality or contribute to those factors that Peter mentioned that would accelerate algae blooms. As a municipality, we spent the better part of 3 decades ensuring that our policies reflect the best available science of the day, and this 2019 update was no exception. We ultimately ended up transitioning from what I would characterize as a pretty complicated and difficult to understand or defend approach, where lakes were put into different categories and different policies applied to different lakes at different times. So we've gone with a simplified approach that considers how we address multiple stressors on the lake and ensure that all lakes, no matter what category they're in, receive a high level of protection when it comes to land use planning. Plus, we've also opened the door to our policies incorporating leading edge science in real time when more and more becomes known about climate change or other external pressures that affect water quality. And we've also moved towards using the district's robust recreational water quality program and our deep data record, which goes back decades, as the primary source of information that will drive policy decisions and also identify early those lakes that might be showing signs of stress. And this does include Rill Lake, as I mentioned, which was recently flagged as vulnerable under the Muskoka official plan due to a confirmed blue-green algae bloom in 2020. So what does this mean from a policy perspective? It means that any development on Rill Lake is now subject to enhanced protection policy. So that adds an extra layer of protection for the lake until it can be further studied. And the enhanced protection policies, they layer on to existing standard protection policies. So what does all this mean? What's a standard policy? What's an enhanced policy? So a standard policy that applies to all lakes are things like minimum lot sizes, ensuring our lots are big enough to properly house septic systems and buildings, having the appropriate setbacks from the water to ensure that we have that nice vegetative buffer between any development and the lake itself, maintaining natural vegetation on the entire lot to the extent possible, managing our stormwater, and minimizing those impervious surfaces. So on top of that, the enhanced policies, they require even greater setbacks from the water's edge for buildings and for septic systems. They want us to look more closely as well on the soils available on the lot so that we can best place our septic system. And advanced septage treatment is also required. So that's trying to minimize, as Peter mentioned, any phosphorus that could come from the septic system and migrate into the lake. And lastly, the policies require 10 years of monitoring of any specific lot that's being developed to ensure that these protection measures stay in place. I do want to flag, though, that there's a limitation to these policies and the official plan in general, in that they only apply to new development or redevelopment when an application is being made under the Planning Act. Some examples are the creation of a new lot, the development of a vacant lot, or seeking an exception of some type to the existing rules. So if you wanted to build a larger cottage or a taller cottage. So those cases would fall under the Muskoka official plan. But other cases wouldn't. And that's why it's so important that we have a multi-pronged approach to recreational water quality that includes the stewardship initiatives that Christy will take you through at the end of the presentation, because you don't have to wait for that. You don't have to be redeveloping your property. We can all do it at any time. Next slide, please, Rebecca. So one of the pillars of the updated lake system health policies is to direct our resources towards focused studies of lakes that are determined to be vulnerable from a water quality perspective. And that includes lakes like Rill, who have had a confirmed blue-green algae bloom, but it could also include lakes that have historically high phosphorus levels or increasing phosphorus levels. And what does this focus study do? The objective is to determine the relative contributing causes to the lake's vulnerability status. So in the case of Rill Lake, it's to try to unpack why did the algae bloom happen when it did. So because we're looking at causes, we call these causation studies. And the studies are tailored to each individual lake, and they have two sides to them, really. They have a scientific investigation side, and then they also have a community outreach side. And they work really well together because the scientific investigation can be informed by historic knowledge of the lake, data that you may have as an association or an individual resident. So they play off each other so that we can get the best background data for the lake. The district did undertake a pilot causation study on Peninsula Lake, which is located partially in the town of Huntsville and partially in the township of Lake of Bays, and that one was completed in 2020. We do have 5 causation studies that are slated to begin in 2021. We're actually just moving forward in April with the initial consultation, and those ones are listed on the slide. The closest one to Rill is Echo Lake. It's our hope that by bundling together these 5 causation studies on lakes across Muskoka, that we'd be able to have a valuable watershed-wide perspective, and that might result in policy or program changes that we can roll out more broadly to all lakes. So for example, if causation studies are pointing towards more extreme weather events and climate change, like Peter talked about, as the main driver of water quality concerns, our official plan policies could then change to enhance lake resiliency. One example is maybe greater setbacks or larger vegetative buffers, which would also actually do a bit of a double duty in response to more frequent or severe flooding events. So if you are interested in the causation study process, you're able to follow along with the 2021 studies by visiting the Engage Muskoka website, and Rebecca, Christy, or I, any of us would be happy to send you the web link after the presentation. You can sign up for updates, which you'll get automatically through your email, or you can just check out the sites when you have time and learn a bit more about causation studies and what they're intended to do. So I'll leave it there, and I think I'm passing it on to Rebecca, but happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you, Summer. Sorry about the mix up with the slides. My computer didn't want to go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Muskoka Watershed Council's algae monitoring program. And Peter mentioned a little bit earlier about how climate change will impact algae. And one recommendation from Muskoka Watershed Council's climate change report that they released in 2016 called Planning for Climate Change in Muskoka included a recommendation that someone develop a new research program on the causes and management of algae blooms in Muskoka lakes. So Watershed Council thought that would be a good task for them to undertake. And following the release of the report, they struck a subcommittee to look at how we can learn more about algal dynamics in our lakes. And it was decided that developing a citizen science monitoring program was the best way forward. After much research and discussion, a pilot project was developed and carried out in 2019, and that was year one of a 2-year pilot project. The point of the pilot project was to collect data on the distribution, abundance, and seasonal cycles of all species of phytoplankton across Muskoka area lakes so that over time, it would be possible to identify conditions favoring algae, detect trends in phytoplankton, and provide management advice. So 4 lake associations participated in the year one of the pilot project, and all of these lakes had experienced a blue-green algae bloom in the recent past. Volunteers from the Leonard Lake Stakeholders Association, Muskoka Lakes Association, Peninsula Lake Association, and 3 Mile Lake Association collected water samples every 2 weeks between June and October from both the near shore and deep water sites on each lake. The samples were collected and frozen, and then they were sent to MWC staff for analysis. To analyze the samples, we would thaw them out and then take readings using a handheld fluorometer. And you can see this is the fluorometer in the background. The fluorometer measures the fluorescence of pigments in the sample. So specifically, it'll measure the fluorescence of chlorophyll A, which is a pigment found in all species of algae. And it'll also measure the fluorescence of phycocyanin, which is a pigment that's only found in blue-green algae. This was a pilot year, so not only were we trying to collect data, but we were actually trying to see if the protocol we developed and the equipment that we built would actually collect the data that we want to collect or collect good data, whether it all worked, whether it was feasible for volunteers to carry out the program. We did have to make some adjustments throughout the summer as small sort of hiccups came up, but overall, the first year of the pilot project did show that we were able to collect data using the equipment and the protocols that we did develop. So what did we find? Some of our preliminary results were, shows that the fluorescence from chlorophyll A, which is the red line on the chart, remained fairly low and constant throughout the season. And we found this on right across all 4 lakes that we sampled. Fluorescence from phycocyanin, which is the blue line, was more variable throughout the season and tended to rise or become greater as the season progressed. This result's expected as conditions that favor blue-green algae blooms, which Peter had discussed earlier, become more prevalent later in the season as nutrients and oxygen in the water become depleted. The green line on the chart is the ratio of phycocyanin to chlorophyll A, and this ratio is used to emphasize changes in the relative proportions of blue-green algae to other algae and can indicate when algae with phycocyanin, so blue-green algae, are starting to dominate the community. One of the lakes participating in the pilot project, 3 Mile Lake, actually experienced an algae bloom while we were collecting samples throughout the summer. The bloom was confirmed by the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks on August 3rd, which unfortunately was between our 2-week sampling period. So we weren't able to collect samples actually during or too close before the bloom, but we were able to collect samples a few days after the bloom was reported. And it did show, our data, as you can see on the chart, does show a pronounced spike in fluorescence of phycocyanin. This spike showed up in both the nearshore and offshore sites for that lake, and neither site was near the location of the bloom. The results indicate that fluorescence can be used to detect a bloom. However, the question remains of, can we detect a bloom before it's visible? So can we get an idea of an algae bloom going to happen before we actually have visual confirmation of it? Additional sampling in year 2 of the pilot project, which is taking place this summer, may help us answer that question. So our next steps for the program are to carry out year 2 of the project this year. We'll be making some adjustments to the protocols and the equipment, as well as adding ad hoc sampling for bloom events. So that'll help us answer that, hopefully help us answer that question of, can we detect an algae bloom before it's visible? We'll be seeking funding to offer the program Muskoka-wide in 2022, contingent on a successful year 2 program, pilot project. And as should be done for any new project, we plan to review it after 5 years to make sure that the algae monitoring program is accomplishing the objectives that we set out for it. And now I'll turn it over to Christy for some information on what you can do.
Great, thanks Rebecca so much. So through these, can you hear me okay? Through these discussions, it's clear that we know a fair bit about algae, but there's also a fair bit of interest being directed at learning more. And through all of that, we know that with our changing climate and with increasing development pressures, strong action is really needed to protect and maintain the health of Muskoka's watershed and hopefully enhance it when we can. And that's where all of us come in. So I did want to speak with you a little bit about what you can do. And I know that was a big question for the lake associations, I think through the questions from David. And there are things that we can do to minimize our impacts on the conditions that we know impact algae. And we've noted some of them here on the slide, so take a look at those. But one of the most crucial things, without question, any shoreline resident can do, or anyone that enjoys shorelines, is let them be natural. And if they're not natural already, try to find ways to renaturalize them. And by that, that means doing less and to keep the water cool, try to find ways to reduce the erosion around your shorelines. Find ways to take up excess nutrients. And there's many shoreline programs now, and many of you are already doing this, that will help with this. And that provides a lot of habitat for algae eating animals. So that's our number one answer to a lot of what you can do on the lake. A question was sent to us from David, and I think it must have come through one of you on the line today. And it was noted that when Rill's algae bloom was first noted, there was some chatter about phosphates and fertilizer contributing to that cause. And a question about, well, weren't these banned already and maybe for more than 10 years? And the answer sadly is no. Phosphorus is increasingly unpopular and it's been banned in many products, but not all. And there's no regulations about how to apply it around lakes. And many fertilizers still have phosphorus and impact the lawns around the lakes. But even if we just chose to use products that didn't have phosphates, it doesn't mean that that will help the algae program in our lakes, because there's so many species of bacteria and cyanobacteria that are able to bloom in nutrient poor water because of their ability to move through the water. So it's definitely advisable to use phosphate-free products when you can find it. They haven't been banned, so Try to choose those when you can. And it really does matter, but mostly leave your vegetation there. That's such a slow way of having phosphates reach the lake and nutrients. Next slide on managing our inputs. Definitely we can all manage our septic systems for those of us that are around waters, and making sure stormwater is managed, using tools like rain barrels, of course, to help with that. And primarily, all of us that love the lakes can do that by enjoying the lakes and watching for condition changes. And Real Lake is doing a really good job at that. I know that many of you have been doing benthic monitoring for a long time, and that collects information. The district definitely has been on Real Lake for many years to watch for water quality changes and conditions. But I guess if I was to leave you with something, and we can talk about this, but I would say that some of the programs that are available now about encouraging the people around your lake to renaturalize or naturalize their shoreline really do matter. And Watershed Council has a few of those, and we can share that with you. It feels like an infomercial now, but here we are. Watershed Council Living in Cottage Country has many good best practices in a handbook about what it is to be a shoreline resident. We also have algae responses on our website too. So if you haven't checked out Muskoka Watershed Council on algae concerns, please do. We know that monitoring the water that you know the best is the answer for many things. And when you notice changes, there are ways to combat that. So maybe through shoreline naturalization projects. But if you see something that looks like algae, especially given what you now know about algae, then you call the Spills Action Line, which is, I think, conveniently 1-800 Ministry of Environment, MOE, tips. And Muskoka Watershed Council has an algae card that we can share with you about that. But if you see changes in your lake, absolutely call that in, because it's the ministry scientists that are the ones to assess what is happening in your lake. And then they work with the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit to talk about how to communicate that. And I know that's an imperfect process, but maybe that's a reasonable place to stop it and leave time for questions. I do hope that some of what we've covered today has answered your questions. We've tried to cover a wide-ranging amount, but perhaps, Nancy, I would now turn it back to you and to the room, because we have so many things we want to talk about.